Let's be honest, most of us didn't get a manual on how to handle love when it feels complicated, especially when you're dealing with someone who pulls away the moment things get close, or maybe you're the one who panics when they don't text back in 10 minutes. Sound familiar? That's not just a relationship issue, it's an attachment pattern. But here's the truth: anxious and avoidant styles aren't life sentences, they're patterns, and patterns can be changed. What you do next can either keep the cycle going or break it for good. That's why I want to give you 5 specific habits that, if you commit to, will shift how you connect in love and attract the kind of connection you actually deserve. When you're in a relationship where either you or your partner leans anxious or avoidant, the smallest actions can feel like emotional landmines. A late reply, a misunderstood message, a shift in tone, these seemingly tiny things can trigger a massive emotional response. An anxious partner might immediately spiral into panic, questioning if they said something wrong, if their partner is losing interest, or if they're about to be abandoned. An avoidant partner might feel suddenly suffocated, like they're being pressured to show up in ways that feel overwhelming. In both cases, what follows is usually a reactive pattern, an emotional overcorrection that doesn't reflect the reality of the moment, but instead reflects a fear-driven response based on past pain. That's why the first habit is learning to stop reacting and start responding with intention. Reactions are fast, emotional, and often unconscious. They're driven by your nervous system trying to protect you from what it perceives as danger, even if the situation doesn't warrant that level of alarm. Let's say your partner doesn't respond to your message for several hours. If you're anxious, your brain might fill in the silence with worst-case scenarios. Instead of waiting calmly or checking in with curiosity, you might send follow-up messages, become passive-aggressive, or even start detaching yourself preemptively to avoid being hurt. If you're avoidant, you might misread an emotional request as a demand and immediately pull back, cancel plans, or go cold to regain a sense of control. Neither of these responses comes from a calm, conscious place. They come from fear. Responding with intention means inserting space between what's happening and how you choose to deal with it. It's the difference between jumping into a defensive argument and asking, "What am I really feeling right now? Is this about them, or is this about something that's being triggered in me?" It's the ability to notice your body tightening, your heart racing, your mind racing ahead to the next 10 possible disasters, and choosing to breathe, pause, and engage from a place of clarity instead of chaos. This doesn't mean denying your feelings or pretending to be okay when you're not. It means owning your experience without letting it hijack your behavior. Developing this habit starts with emotional awareness. You need to start noticing your triggers and patterns. What words, actions, or moments consistently make you feel like you're not safe, not loved, or not good enough. Once you identify them, you can begin to anticipate your responses and create strategies to stay grounded when they appear. For someone anxious, that might mean setting a rule not to double text within a certain time frame and instead redirecting your focus to something calming or productive. For someone avoidant, it might mean pushing yourself to stay present in emotionally vulnerable moments instead of disappearing or shutting down. The idea isn't to suppress your needs, but to engage them in a healthier, more measured way. Another part of responding with intention is challenging the story in your head. Anxious or avoidant minds are masters at writing scripts that haven't happened yet. They don't love me anymore. They're trying to control me. They're going to leave. These narratives are usually not based in fact, they're based in fear. And if you're not careful, you'll start reacting to the story instead of the reality. One of the most powerful things you can do is pause and ask yourself, what else could be true? What's the evidence for the worst case scenario I'm imagining? What's the best case scenario? That small mental shift can be the difference between a meltdown and a meaningful conversation. Also, responding with intention involves learning to speak from vulnerability instead of accusation. Instead of saying, "You never text me back," you say, "When I don't hear from you, I start to feel anxious and I worry something's wrong." Instead of saying, "You're too needy," you say, "Sometimes I feel overwhelmed when I don't have space to process things." This kind of language doesn't trigger defensiveness, it invites empathy. And when you make a habit of responding instead of reacting, your relationship begins to feel safer, not just for your partner, but for you. In relationships where one or both partners have anxious or avoidant attachment patterns, the concept of space can often feel threatening or misunderstood. For the anxious partner, space might be perceived as rejection, abandonment, or disinterest. For the avoidant partner, space often feels like a lifeline, something necessary to maintain their sense of identity, autonomy, and emotional safety. The problem is that both people can be caught in a tug of war, one pulling for closeness, the other retreating to protect themselves. And if they don't learn to create space without creating distance, the relationship quickly becomes a cycle of emotional whiplash. Creating space doesn't mean withdrawing emotionally, ghosting your partner for days, or using silence as a form of punishment. Nor does it mean overwhelming someone with constant communication and closeness in the name of love. Instead, it's about intentionally cultivating an environment where each person feels secure enough to breathe, reflect, and recharge without fearing that the connection will be lost or damaged in the process. For anxious individuals, this means recognizing that space isn't always a sign of something going wrong. It's not proof that someone is losing interest or planning to leave. Sometimes space is simply a human need. People process emotions differently. They recharge in solitude. They reflect without always verbalizing every step. That doesn't mean they don't care. It means they're trying to show up better, with more clarity and presence. When you create space without creating distance, you make it possible for your relationship to have rhythm instead of tension. It allows each person to expand into their individuality without compromising the bond. For the avoidant person, this habit requires an understanding that their need for space must be communicated clearly and compassionately. Disappearing, shutting down, or becoming vague only confirms the fears of the anxious partner and erodes trust. Instead, it's about saying something like, "I need a little time to think and recharge today, but I'm still here and I care about you." That one sentence can bridge the gap between healthy space and harmful distance. This habit also demands that both people learn to self-regulate during periods of space. An anxious person must resist the urge to fill the silence with assumptions or frantic attempts at reconnection. Instead, they can lean into activities that reinforce their self-worth and independence, whether that's time with friends, creative pursuits, or self-care rituals that remind them they are whole even when they aren't receiving constant attention. For the avoidant partner, it means using that space not as an escape from emotional intimacy, but as an opportunity to reflect on what they feel and how they want to re-engage with their partner, not just how to avoid discomfort. There's a critical difference between space that heals and space that harms. Healing space is agreed upon, understood, and emotionally safe. Harmful space is confusing, unpredictable, and laced with emotional punishment or avoidance. That's why this habit requires honest conversations about what space looks like for each person. Is it time apart after a disagreement? Is it a night alone to reset? Is it time to journal, take a walk, or simply not talk about emotions for a moment? There's no universal answer, but clarity is everything. When both people understand the intention behind the space, it loses its sting and starts to serve the relationship instead of threatening it. Another essential part of this habit is learning to reconnect after space has been created. Often, couples fail not because they needed time apart, but because they didn't know how to come back together. Reconnection should feel like a conscious act, not just slipping back into routine, but checking in with presence and vulnerability. It might be as simple as saying, "I missed you," or "How are you feeling now?" That bridge is what makes space productive. Without that step, space can feel like emotional limbo, where one person waits and wonders while the other avoids and deflects. When you have an anxious or avoidant attachment style, one of the biggest mistakes you can make in a relationship is outsourcing your emotional regulation to your partner. This is especially true for someone with an anxious attachment. In moments of insecurity, fear, or doubt, it becomes second nature to reach for immediate reassurance, whether that's through constant texting, asking repeated questions about how your partner feels, or interpreting every action or inaction as a sign of something deeper. It creates a cycle where your emotions feel tethered to another person's responses, which is not only exhausting for them, but disempowering for you. On the other hand, if you're avoidant, you may not overtly seek reassurance, but you might still be relying on space or detachment as a way to avoid emotional discomfort, which in itself is another form of emotional outsourcing. You're letting your coping mechanism do the work that self-reflection and self-soothing should be doing. The habit of prioritizing self-soothing over constant reassurance is about learning how to hold your emotional experience with compassion and maturity, instead of placing that responsibility on your partner's shoulders every time you feel discomfort. It doesn't mean you can't express your needs or be vulnerable. It means you develop the ability to calm your own nervous system before bringing the conversation into the relationship. When something triggers you, instead of immediately needing a text back, a compliment, or verbal affirmation, you pause and ask yourself, what's really going on? What am I afraid of right now? What is this moment reminding me of from my past? Is this about what's happening or about something deeper that's unresolved within me? Self-soothing is not a natural reflex for many people. It often requires unlearning old patterns of panic and urgency. If you grew up in an environment where love was inconsistent or where emotional expression was either ignored or overwhelmed, then you likely internalize the belief that emotional safety comes from outside of you. So now, as an adult, you might feel like the only way to feel secure is to get your partner to tell you exactly what you want to hear or act in a very specific way. But this creates a dependency that leaves you feeling fragile because your sense of worth and safety becomes conditional on someone else's ability to constantly manage your emotional state. The process of developing this habit starts with regulation techniques that reconnect you to your body and mind when you're activated. That could be as simple as breath work, grounding exercises, journaling, or even stepping outside for a walk. It might look like delaying your response to a triggering message by 5 minutes, then 10, then 20, as you practice calming down before deciding what to say or whether you even need to say anything. Over time, you begin to experience a powerful shift. You no longer feel held hostage by your emotional waves. You start to realize that just because you feel something intensely doesn't mean you have to act on it immediately or ask someone else to fix it. For the anxious partner, self-soothing helps you come back to yourself. Instead of spiraling into stories of being unloved or unimportant, you remind yourself that your feelings are valid but temporary, that you are worthy even in silence, and that your value doesn't decrease in moments of uncertainty. For the avoidant partner, self-soothing allows you to stay emotionally present without shutting down. Instead of disconnecting or escaping, you can sit with discomfort long enough to understand what's driving it, which often reveals that your fear of being overwhelmed is more about old wounds than the current relationship. This habit also builds a stronger foundation for intimacy. When you bring a regulated, grounded version of yourself into the relationship, your communication becomes clearer, your needs become easier to express, and your partner doesn't feel responsible for managing your emotional temperature at all times. It creates mutual safety because both people are showing up from a place of ownership rather than emotional dependency or avoidance. One of the most common ways anxious and avoidant partners unconsciously damage their relationships is through how they communicate boundaries, or more accurately, how they don't. Anxious individuals often struggle to express their boundaries clearly because they fear rejection or abandonment. They may suppress their true needs to keep the peace or to avoid being seen as needy. Instead of saying, "I need more consistency in how we communicate," they say nothing and hope the other person magically picks up on it. When the need isn't met, resentment builds, and when that resentment reaches its breaking point, it erupts in a way that feels confusing and disproportionate to the person on the receiving end. Avoidant individuals, on the other hand, often communicate boundaries as ultimatums or through withdrawal. Instead of saying, I need some space to process what I'm feeling, they go quiet for days or become cold and distant, hoping the other person will just take the hint. These approaches don't create safety, they create emotional landmines. The key habit here is learning to communicate boundaries without ultimatums. Boundaries are not about control, they're about clarity. They are not threats or punishments. They are not demands that come from fear. They are expressions of what you need to feel safe, secure, and respected within a relationship. Communicating a boundary from a grounded place sounds very different than lashing out during an argument or throwing out a take it or leave it condition in a moment of emotional overload. When you're able to calmly state a boundary, you're actually giving your partner a roadmap for how to love you well. You're not asking them to change who they are, but you are inviting them to understand who you are and what you need in order to show up at your best. For the anxious partner, this means you must begin to separate expressing a boundary from the fear that doing so will scare someone away. You can say, "It's important to me that we don't go more than a day without checking in, even if it's just a quick message," and understand that communicating that need isn't an act of desperation, it's an act of self-respect. If someone disappears for days without explanation and that deeply hurts you, the answer isn't to pretend you're fine with it. The answer is to express that this dynamic doesn't feel supportive to your emotional well-being. If the relationship is going to grow, it needs to include space for your voice, not just your silence. For the avoidant partner, the challenge is to stop using distance as your primary form of boundary setting. Pulling away without communication is not a healthy boundary. It's avoidance dressed up as independence. Instead of saying, "I need time to myself," you go dark. Instead of saying, "I feel overwhelmed and need space to think," you act irritated or detached. This creates confusion and anxiety in your partner, especially if they're prone to anxious attachment. The goal isn't to stop needing space, it's to learn how to clearly and kindly ask for it. When you express a boundary with empathy, it becomes something your partner can understand and respect, rather than fear and resist. There's also a deeper layer to this habit, which is learning to handle what happens after you communicate a boundary. Sometimes people won't like what you ask for. Sometimes they'll push back or get defensive. That doesn't mean your boundary was wrong. It means you're in a real relationship with two different people trying to negotiate emotional needs. The goal isn't to avoid discomfort, it's to stay present through it. If you've always used ultimatums, "If you don't do this, I'm done," or "This is just who I am, take it or leave it," then chances are you've confused boundaries with control. Real boundaries are about you, not about changing the other person. They are you saying, "This is what I'm available for," and letting the other person respond as they choose. When someone operates from an anxious or avoidant attachment style, they often confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth. In anxious attachment, relationships can become a roller coaster of highs and lows, passionate declarations followed by panic and insecurity, connection followed by fear of disconnection. It's easy to mistake the rush of anxiety for the presence of love. Avoidant individuals, on the other hand, may equate deep emotion with chaos or a loss of control. So they pull away when things get intense or vulnerable, mistaking calm and consistency for boredom. Both styles can fall into the trap of measuring the strength of a relationship based on how heightened their emotions are. But emotional maturity isn't about intensity, it's about stability. It's not how loud the emotions are, it's how responsibly they're managed. Emotional maturity means being able to sit with discomfort without needing to escape it or explode from it. It means being able to hold someone else's emotions without making them about you or seeing them as a threat. When an anxious partner says, "I feel scared when I don't hear from you," emotional maturity allows the other person to hear that without reacting with blame or guilt. When an avoidant partner says, "I feel overwhelmed when I'm expected to share constantly," emotional maturity allows the anxious partner to understand that without taking it as rejection. This kind of understanding requires a strong sense of self, because if you're still looking to your partner to validate every feeling you have, or still trying to avoid every vulnerable moment, you'll constantly be pulled into defensive or reactive behaviors. Emotional maturity also involves recognizing that conflict isn't a sign that the relationship is broken. It's a sign that two people are learning how to coexist with different fears, needs, and communication styles. An emotionally immature response to conflict looks like shutting down, blowing up, giving the silent treatment, or threatening the relationship every time something doesn't go your way. An emotionally mature response is about staying present during hard conversations, staying curious about the other person's experience, and knowing how to express your truth without needing to dominate or retreat. It's the ability to say what you mean what you say, and still hold space for someone else's truth, even when it's not convenient or comfortable. This habit also includes emotional responsibility. When you are emotionally mature, you stop blaming your partner for every feeling you have. You don't say, "You made me feel this way," as a default. You ask, "What about this situation is activating something in me?" That doesn't mean you excuse bad behavior or ignore red flags. But you do start to understand that your emotional reactions are a mix of the present moment and your emotional history. This allows you to be more thoughtful in your responses. Instead of lashing out or shutting down, you approach conversations with curiosity and self-awareness. You begin to notice your own patterns and take ownership of them, which makes it easier for your partner to do the same. Another aspect of emotional maturity is delayed gratification. In emotionally immature dynamics, you want your needs met now. You want the reply, the validation, the space, or the resolution instantly. But in reality, healthy love requires patience. Sometimes your partner is not in the emotional space to meet your need the moment you express it. Sometimes they're processing or struggling or just trying to understand how to show up in the right way. Emotional maturity allows you to sit in the space between the request and the response without panicking or shutting down. It allows you to give grace to the process instead of demanding instant relief. It's the ability to see the long game, to trust the relationship enough to not let every emotional wave dictate the state of the connection. At the heart of this habit is a deep shift from performance to presence. You're no longer trying to prove your worth by being the perfect partner, nor are you trying to protect your heart by staying detached. You're simply showing up as you are with emotional honesty and integrity. You're choosing connection, not because it always feels good, but because it's worth working through the discomfort for.